Thank you everyone so much today for joining us. This is the first presentation of Woke Not Broke using the Social Conformity Index system to assess Zineability. So we're really excited to share these unprecedented consumer insights with you today and hopefully have them help you in your own zine making and, more importantly, zine sales. So jumping right in today, we're gonna do a little bit of housekeeping, introductions and welcome. Then I'm gonna give you a quick overview of what we're going to talk through today, explain the methodology for the study, and then jump right into the key driver analysis insights. And then segue into covering the Social Conformity Index system. So explaining what that means, going over the guiding concepts, and then addressing how that can help you assess Zineability, and then also what Zineability means. From there, we're going to jump into 4 in-depth Zineable consumer profiles that you can take with you into your work. And then lastly, we're going to share some important tips and quick wins that you can use to harness Zineability along the path to purchase. So in layman's terms, sell more zines. And then lastly, we'll have a section here at the end for question and answer for any questions that come up. So just a quick overview of who we are. The Institute of Sociometry is an international communications cooperative specializing in conceptual explorations of how individuals relate to groups. So both myself and my colleague Peter here are agents of the Institute of Sociometry, who is the parent and umbrella organization who has sponsored this research we're presenting here today. So a little bit about me. My name is Heather Link Bergman, and I'm the Director of Intelligence of the Institute of Sociometry. And I've been leading the Consumer Insights Division since about 2019, where I oversee company vision, technology, product strategy, and marketing. So I have over 30 years of experience, and I'm a pioneer in zine consumer research technology and product marketing. So my goal is engineering unprecedented growth and profitability in the self-publishing sector, which has largely been ignored in this kind of market research space. All right, so we're gonna jump in here a little bit into methodology, so how we collected this data. But let's start off with a few definitions here. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, a zine is a self-published, non-commercial, often homemade publication that's usually devoted to a specialized and sometimes unconventional subject matter. So zines, like the zines that you see behind me, are typically a physical booklet or object, although some of them can be published online. So then another few really important terms you're going to hear me throw out are impressions. And so essentially this is also referred to as traffic. This term refers to the point in which the lil is viewed by a person, or when it is displayed to a person wherein they may not actually look at it. So it's really important to remember that distinction. It's when the lil is displayed. Consumer does not have to actually look at the lil in order for it to count as an impression. And engagement is anytime someone engages with the lil. So it's pretty self-explanatory. So that can be anything from touching it, examining it at length, opening up the lid and looking at the contents inside, or urinating on it. Glancing at the lil does not count towards engagement rate in this analysis. And I'll explain a little bit why when we get into the nuts and bolts of the methodology. And then lastly, a conversion. So this is essentially anytime a consumer takes an action that you've defined as valuable to your business. So for our purposes, this would include someone taking a zine or periodical that's stocked in the lil and or making a submission to the lil. So this could be adding your own zine or periodical or another object to the lil. So during the 73-day study period, we used the Campai camera, which is a $29.99 doorbell camera bought off of Amazon, to capture 3,704 impressions. In order to make the analysis a little bit more manageable, we narrowed that down to a sample size of about 300 that was selected at random. And then we analyzed the sample through 13 factors. So these factors include qualitative and quantitative analysis. And so these factors can be anything from date, day part, day of week, number of people, age, ethnicity, and of course, social conformity index score, which we'll get into more later on in this presentation. So some limitations of this sample include the fact that this study reflects findings for the Denver market only, and I would really hesitate to say that this reflects findings for, Denver overall. Really, we could safely say that it's confined to the West Wash Park neighborhood of Denver. Additional limitations of this sample are that when a consumer engages or converts with the LIL, the CamHI is going to capture multiple images in order to allow researchers to study that consumer interaction in greater detail. So given the random sample selection, some of those images that may have captured the consumer either engaging or converting with the LIL may not have actually been selected in that sample. And so essentially what that means is you may inadvertently observe a consumer in the sample who did convert, but it doesn't appear as if they're converting in that image. However, the sample size is large enough overall where this doesn't really significantly impact the validity of the findings presented here today. And so then lastly, before we really jump in, I wanted to just reground ourselves in what generally consumer attitudes are around data collection and surveillance. So what I found in just looking at some kind of prominent and more recent research is that 83% of shoppers would actually exchange data for a more personalized experience. So what this really tells us is the majority of shoppers are comfortable with this idea of companies having information on them. And while 79% of consumers who were surveyed in another study believed that companies knew too much about them, still 90% were willing to share behavioral data for a cheaper or an easier brand experience. And so this is really important to remember that, consumers generally, when they're introduced to this notion of a company having data or information on them, that doesn't really feel great. But when they realize the trade-off of what they can get and that enormous value a company can deliver to them as a result of having a lot of personal data information, many of them, see that value as well. Okay. So now we're going to jump into the key driver analysis here. So I'm going to go through by each factor and point out some interesting highlights. First of all, most importantly, when we look at this sample and examine the consumer behavior, about 2% of the sample convert. Again, that is taking an action that's valuable, such as taking a zine or a periodical. 2% engage, so this is any kind of engagement with that LIL. And out of the sample, 97% did not convert or engage. And so what this is telling us is that you cannot even give these things away for free. Generally, the population just doesn't really want zines, but that's not going to stop us. So then once we get into day part, we have some pretty interesting findings here. So when we look at conversions by day part, what this tells us is that most consumers prefer to make their purchases in the afternoon, but there are some key parts of day that may be very valuable for a zinester to consider. So for example, mid-morning could be favorable for capturing those early birds who may be primed to both browse and convert. So mid-morning sees relatively little traffic. It's just about 10% of all traffic that goes by the LIL, and yet 20% of all browsing and 20% of all purchases are occurring in this day part. So similar to mid-morning, nighttime may also be favorable for closing your day strong. So again, we see relatively little traffic, so it's just about 12%, but 20% of all browsing occurs during this day part, and 20% of all purchases also occur during this day part. And then lastly, late night is the sleeper day part to capture sales. 20% of purchases occur during this day part, which accounts for nearly 7% of all traffic. I should point out that other data suggests that this could be purchases made by consumers who had browsed during earlier day parts, who then came back to convert. So day of week, overall, consumers expressed a bit of a preference for browsing and purchasing on the weekend. Most conversions do happen during the weekdays, so it indicates that maybe there is like a preference there. But I hesitate to say that, just considering the fact that, you know, certainly there are more days in the actual weekday than on the weekend. And, you know, also weekday purchases may actually be the result of weekend browsing. So perceived gender. So curious, conversions by gender, we do see consumers who identify as male as the primary purchasers of zines, although 20% who identify as female also do convert. What's really noticeable of this is engagements by perceived gender. 100% of engagements happened with consumers who identify as male, with no engagements occurring with consumers who identify as female or consumers who would prefer not to say. What's also interesting is conversions by perceived age compared to engagements by perceived age. So preference for browsing tends to skew younger, while purchases and/or conversions tend to happen with older consumers. So what's important to note is that minors, so those identified as under the age of 18, or seniors, so those over the age of 65, never convert or engage, even though they were included in this sample. What's also really interesting is that once a consumer turns 55, they seem to really age out of caring about zines. And there's a little bit more on that later as we get into those consumer profiles. The primary age demographic are consumers that are ages 25 to 35. So these folks account for 20% of all browsing and 60% of all purchases. So about 3 out of 5 purchases were made by this cohort. So that's a pretty big audience. However, as we're going to discover later as we talk about those profiles, age isn't the only factor that determines overall zineability. In fact, none of these drivers alone are going to be what's determining that overall zineability for a consumer. So getting into perceived ethnicity, Caucasian consumers account for almost all browsing and almost all purchases. So what this really kind of tells us is that there may be an issue where consumers of color are unable to find products that resonate, or that the browsing or purchase experience is somehow undesirable, unpleasant, or unwelcoming. There's got to be another kind of confounding factor going on here. So another factor to consider is that the LIL, as with all little free libraries, it itself could be considered private property. And in fact, the LIL and little free libraries are often on someone's private property. So whether they're in their front yard or their hail strip. So something that us researchers need to understand is that consumers of color are understandably probably pretty wary of browsing, and or maybe reluctant to engage with anything, no matter how enticing, when they're unsure of what kind of nut job is putting this thing out in their front yard. And this is also something to consider with consumers who identify as female or who prefer not to say as well. So the point of this is that certainly is a need to create safe spaces so all consumers can feel comfortable. Indeed, this trend towards instituting safe space policies at virtual and in-person Zine Fest is a step in the right direction, and is ultimately going to lead more diverse consumers down the path to purchase. So a really important insight to consider with your zines. So with direction of travel, really interestingly, consumers who are traveling north are both more likely to convert and are more likely to engage. And what's also interesting is that directionless consumers, while they're an extremely small portion of consumers overall, are statistically a lot more likely to browse and purchase and or convert or engage as well. So 60% of all directionless consumers either converted or engaged, which is a really large portion if you think about just how few consumers even, look at this thing. So with mode of travel, consumers who travel by foot account for the majority of browsing and purchases. A couple other important constituencies are cyclists and consumers who travel by other. So other is presumably someone who's standing still, teleporting, something like that. They're also another important segment. What's really interesting is that cyclists don't browse, maybe because they're on a bike, they just don't really have time. I don't know. It pends further research. And so lastly, presence of pet. So although consumers without pets account for most observed conversions and engagements, consumers with pets, do convert and engage. Overall, there's really not a statistical difference between the two. So whether or not there's a presence of pet doesn't really have much influence on consumer behavior. However, the recommendation is that Zinesters should consider accommodations for consumers with pets, as it may be important to increasing conversions with consumers who do have pets. All right, so now we're going to dig into Social Conformity Index and learn all about that. So a couple guiding concepts here. The Social Conformity Index system overall is intended to be intuitive, targeted, and potent. So what we aim to do is to create a marketing tool that could be simple to use, operate at an accurate level, and most importantly, be deployed to increase zine sales. So again, when you can't even give these things away for free, you're going to need all the help that you can get. And then to define the term zineability, essentially the term zineability means is how likely are you able to get a zine in that consumer's hands? So the concept of the Social Conformity Index system is pretty intuitive. As consumers move through different life stages, you can observe changes in dress, mannerisms, and behavior. And that this data, when combined with the Lil Sonic key driver analysis, can reveal a unique and novel system to assess zineability with unprecedented ease and accuracy. So the Social Conformity Index system is, I should note, a proprietary Lil consumer segmentation system to assess zineability. So the reason why I'm a little vague on details here is that it is a proprietary system. So Social Conformity Index at a glance, it should be worth noting the Social Conformity Index scale goes anywhere between 1 to 10. And some people get a little tripped up on this. The higher the score, the higher likelihood the consumer does not socially conform, okay? So an important thing to remember is the lower your score, the more you conform. The higher your score, the more you deviate, the more you exhibit behavior, mannerisms that indicate a lack of conformity. And the reason why the scale is set up this way is we wanted to acknowledge the fact that, conformity is measurable, right? There's like a baseline there. Like total and perfect conformity is a number one. You can't like go -1 or -2. It's just, that's kind of your base there. Whereas the ability for a consumer to deviate from that and to not conform, the sky's the limit, frankly. So when we developed this system, we developed the scale of 1 to 10. Of course, pending further research, we can discover new and exotic ways in which consumers can surprise us. So that, again, that's an acknowledgement of how this scale is developed and how to best interpret it. So another couple of things to point out here. The average Social Conformity Index score across the entire sample is about 4.2. The average Social Conformity Index score among consumers who engage is quite a bit higher at 6.7. And then the average Social Conformity Index score among consumers who convert is even higher still at a high 7.4. And so this is really significant because 72% of consumers, so that's about 3/4 of all your consumers, are going to have a Social Conformity Index score of below 5. It's really only 8% of your consumers who are going to have that Social Conformity Index score of above 8. So it's pretty significant. What this tells us is that if you're a consumer who engages and if you're a consumer who converts, you're you're gonna have a higher social conformity index score. So then how do we make sense of all of this? The way that we do it is dividing the scores up into groups. So we split them up into 4 different groups here. We have the 1, 2, 3, 4s, we have the 5, 6s, we have the 7, 8s, and then we have the 9, 10s. And then what we do is we cluster those groups. And these 4 different clusters reveal 4 distinct different types of consumers. So among these clusters, we have our negative persona. So of course, it's important to, as important as it is to understand who you want to be talking to, it also provides a lot of clarity to understand who you really shouldn't be bothering with. So we include this negative persona. Then we move on to our curious and questioning cluster, onto our persuadable convertible cluster, and then last we have our Zineable core consumers. So these are consumers who are confirmed Zineable. And then from here, it was a marriage of, I would say, art and science. So we had our analysts analyze this data, of course, and develop those psychographic profiles and pull out those kind of key insights. But then marketers are the ones who came up with the clever names and the narratives about each group that you're going to hear about today. And these are really not only going to help us demonstrate the differences between these clusters, but it gives each cluster flair, because we need to remember we're marketing to people, not data. Okay, so now we're going to jump into our 4 different clusters. So first off, we have our comfortable complacence. So again, this is group 1, 2, 3, and this is cluster B. It is a negative consumer persona. So again, remember, this is who you are not wanting to be talking to. And we have dubbed them comfortable complacents. So I'm going to read you a little bit about them. Comfortable complacents don't have time for zines, as they are typically engaged in other hobbies, including running, mountain biking, scootering, brunching, and shopping. You can find them out walking their purebred dogs or toting their children and shopping bags on their excursions. They have an affinity for takeout food to fuel their busy and active lifestyles. Backpacks, athletic and athleisure clothing, running sneakers, and Birkenstock sandals keep them comfortable, but not cool. When not at leisure, they express themselves with tidy and pastel-colored clothing. Male comfortable complacents typically tuck their shirts into freshly pressed khakis and perch Oakley sunglasses on their brow to frame their clean-shaven faces and shortly groomed hair. Female comfortable complacents regularly indulge in salon treatments to keep their long tresses alluringly blonde, which is the most popular hair color of this cluster, and uniformly straight. While their sneakers may be as white as the pure-driven snow, this group encompasses a wide swath of ethnicities. With safety on their minds and bike helmets on their heads, they are comfortable in making the safe choice to consume conventional literature if they read it all. And so what's really interesting about this group is, from an age perspective, they encompass all ages that we observed in this study, both through minors to seniors. And they're overall a much more diverse audience. So while there are slightly fewer Caucasian or Black or African Americans in this audience, it does include more Hispanic and Latinx consumers, Asian consumers, and consumers who would prefer not to say or identify as some other race. So another really important thing to remember about this cluster is that they are a lot less likely to bike, but they love to run and jog. This is also the only group that uses scooters, and interestingly, the only group that we observed using skateboards. Although their skateboard preferences are pretty lame, we've seen only longboards within this cluster. And that this cluster also has a higher than average presence of pet. So 17% have a pet. These pets tend to be lighter haired and pure breed. So a lot of golden retrievers and golden Labradors. And what's also really interesting about this group is that they may not be cool, but they really do not like feeling warm. So this group loves to wear shorts, sandals, and Birkenstock sandals are particularly popular with this cluster. Okay. So moving on to alt curious. So this is our group 5-6, our cluster CQ. So their denim is slimmer and darker, and their plaid shirts are typically untucked. The alt-curious cluster is dipping their Converse sneakered toe into the world of counterculture. These 25 to 35-year-olds enjoy getting out and about on weekends, socializing, and staying out late, which may explain their softer physiques. This group is more likely to walk and bike, but they do it for leisure and business, not exercise. If this group exercises at all, they do it in black sneakers with black socks and faux vintage baseball t-shirts that were likely purchased from a mass market retailer. You can note this cluster by their fondness for plaid and the presence of musical instruments toted around in black nylon carryalls. This cluster enjoys exploring various aspects of consumer culture in addition to zines, including alternative rock music and tattoos, although those are typically placed in safe, tasteful locations on the ankle or upper arm. They may be interested in the arts and enjoy spending their disposable income purchasing clothes for themselves. Some may call this cluster posers. All curious consumers like to browse, but they're not very likely to buy. And so a couple other things to note about this cluster is they're a little bit more likely to be male. From an age perspective, they do skew younger. And from a diversity perspective, they're less likely to be Hispanic or Latinx, but they are more likely to be Black or African American or identify as Caucasian. This group is a lot less likely to have a pet, and if they do have a pet, they prefer mid to large size short-haired breeds and mutts. And this group is also a lot more likely to smoke tobacco. And what's really interesting about this group and any kind of group that we talk about subsequently after the fact is once you score over a 5 on the Social Conformity Index system, your propensity to wear color just completely disappears. So you can see it first with this cluster where they almost uniformly prefer to wear darker colored clothing in hues of gray or green or navy. And that male consumers in this cluster are a lot more likely to experiment with longer hairstyles or ponytails or man buns. And that female consumers in this cluster tend to embrace alternative hairstyles and or colors in bright hues. All right, Bohemian ways. So this is our group 7-8 and our cluster PC. You can spot them walking in stylishly slim, low-cut boots whilst clad in head-to-toe black, no matter the season. Bohemian ways are 45-year-old plus childless men who aren't afraid to wear a tank top to show off their numerous tattoos. While quite fond of the color black, this group enjoys flamboyant dressing and laxer grooming standards than other clusters. While they are not tobacco users, they do enjoy recreational marijuana. There's a great diversity of hairstyles in this cluster. Long locks, shaved heads, undercuts, and luxuriant facial hair dominate. Female Bohemian ways, there's thick-framed glasses. She lets her hair go naturally curly and gray at the temples, but don't worry, she's still got it in her high-waisted, tight vintage denim. Consumers in this cluster are much more likely to be Caucasian, which explains how their fashion preferences tend to hew to the hegemonic kind of white cis male standard of quote unquote cool. But that can also describe a lot of zines too, right? So while the zine scene is much more inclusive of Black, Indigenous, people of color, female voices, and queer voices, supply, as we know, tends to meet demand. And as the Bohemian Ways cluster indicates, one of the primary consumers of zines are middle-aged, white, cisgendered men. So a couple other important things to note about this cluster is that they're statistically more likely to be male, and that from an age perspective, there's a pretty interesting spread going on. So while there are a number of 21 to 25-year-old Bohemian Ways consumers, more often this cluster tends to skew a bit older. So they are much more likely to be over the age of 45. And from an ethnicity perspective, they are more likely to be Caucasian. So other couple of insights to round this out. This cluster tends to eschew color almost entirely, and they have a strong preference for head-to-toe black clothing. They really enjoy booties. So whether they're lace-up combat boots or a Chelsea-style boot, many in this cluster wear that type of footwear. And that they do have a preference for late morning and early evening. So there is a noticeable aversion to night and late night. So this could be due to the more advanced age of this cluster. Lastly, we have iconoclastic lifestyles. So elusive and rarefied iconoclastic lifestyles as a cluster is hard to define. Indeed, their propensity to not conform is one of the few characteristics that unite them. This cluster is mostly 45 to 55-year-old men. However, pending further research, this analyst suspects that they lurk amongst us, hiding in plain sight in all corners of conventional and civilized society. There is emerging evidence that when all curious approaches middle age, many transition into the bohemian waste cluster, while others tend to fall into that comfortable complacence cluster. It's then theorized that bohemian waste consumers who continue to resist the ease and the allure of the comfortable complacent cluster eventually join this iconic lifestyles cluster as they move further along in both their personal life cycle, then also their evolution as a consumer. However, further research is certainly necessary into this and pending. And one last thing to note about iconoclastic lifestyles is that they are the primary consumers of zines and they are your core consumer. They do not browse. They're a rare breed, a consumer who knows exactly what they want and isn't afraid to reach out and take it. So a couple other tidbits about this cluster. They're a lot more likely to bike. 33% of them have pets. So out of all of the clusters, they are a lot more likely to have a pet. And they tend to favor pit bulls, Dobermans, and mutts. They do have a preference for worn and vintage clothing, although occasionally they enjoy being topless. This cluster craves comfort, and that while they're generally slim, they do show a preference for leisure clothing. So out of all clusters, this is the only group that we've observed wearing flip-flops. Okay. So now that we've learned a little bit about these clusters and who they are, let's get down to the thing we're all here for today, learning how to sell zines to them. So with comfortable complacence, I think my best advice to you is just don't bother. This cluster is too expensive and difficult to convert. You're not going to see a good return on your investment. So the only exception to this is if a comfortable complacent is a relative, immediate family member, child, or spouse of the zinester. So while it's fairly uncommon for adult zinesters to share a household with a comfortable complacent, it certainly can happen. And indeed, many zinesters come from families of origin that are painfully complacent. So comfortable complacents can typically be begrudgingly coerced into consumption if they're roped into attending a zine fair. So this exciting cluster, ZineFest Widow, is an emerging and exciting group that deserves further study and research. Their purchasing power tends to exceed some of the other convertible clusters due to their more conventional career choices and more prudent financial decision making. So bottom line, they actually have money to spend. So with all curious, one of the most important things that you can do is work on leveraging their burgeoning engagement to move them farther along that path to purchase. So as I mentioned, this is a group that really enjoys browsing, but they haven't really quite shown the ability to convert quite yet. So one tip for them is to consider an enhanced point of sale fixtures and placement, or sorry, point of purchase fixtures and placements to encourage lingering. And you could also consider having a sales associate engage this consumer in conversation. It's particularly important to have them point them towards those sort of tamer zines in your inventory. And so again, remember, this cluster really loves to browse after dark. So a tasteful string of trendy twinkle lights or paper lanterns can enhance their experience. And it's also worth mentioning, you need to see what you're looking at in order to be able to buy it. And so while it's not typical in this sector of self-publishing and zines, you may want to consider a return policy. So that return policy is what can turn a meh into a hell yeah with this group. The shame of actually returning a zine for the measly $5 to $7 refund is just too embarrassing for this cluster, and not to mention time consuming. So, you know, frankly, you're not really going to lose a lot of revenue by offering this. And then lastly, our best piece of advice is to not come on too strong. So titles such as Thank God for Abortion, The Art of Menstruation, or Slave Nation are not really appropriate starter zines. So you might want to try something like The Art and Science for Billboard Improvement for its kind of pranktivism 101 laughs, or Heal Land, or For Your Health. So these are topical zines that speak to liberal causes that this cluster tends to enjoy, but they're not going to inflame religious zealotry. So with Bohemian Ways loves to browse and is also a lot more likely to actually convert than All Curious. So an opportunity for you with this cluster is to focus on increasing basket size, which essentially means you want to increase the number of zines this consumer is walking away with. So in order to do this, we recommend stocking a series. So this gives Bohemian Ways a way to learn about and purchase zines in a series, so purchasing multiple zines. It gives them an opportunity to curate a collection. So what you're also going to want to do with this cluster is to make sure you have an alternate sales associate available to engage with them while you can engage other consumers. So Bohemian Ways is going to likely have a creative project or pursuit of his own to talk to you about. So whether it's his band or his latest photography project, you're going to want to make sure you're devoting a good 15 to 20 minutes to listening to him talk about his stuff. So be sure to also carry business cards in case he ever asks to see if you could, oh, I don't know, print a zine with a collection of his photographs. You're probably never going to hear from him again, but you know, you never know. So Bohemian Ways is comfortably woke, but don't push it. Titles like Resisting the Male Gaze, Total Control, or Citizen Black may only get a polite nod and a mm-hmm as he squirms uncomfortably in his Chelsea boots. Bohemian Ways prefers to make his purchases during the week. So while most zinesters run their businesses as a side weekend hustle, you're going to need to make sure that you have your sales channels available and accessible during the weeks to meet the needs of this cluster. And then lastly, due to the age of Bohemian Ways, they may actually remember the days when zinesters used to produce zines through cruder technologies such as photocopiers or mimeographs. They gravitate towards zines with a more distressed aesthetic or punk rock subject matter. And it's important to note that the more obscure the band or the scene is, the more likely they're going to want to convert. And so then lastly, we have our iconoclastic lifestyles. The tip with these consumers is that anything goes. You could say that they're woke, but they don't really know what that means, and they don't really give a fuck. The more obscure, the better with this group. If you can happen to stock titles that catalog your expansive collection of Kmart in-store music cassettes, or a photography zine exclusively of screen grabs of Jerry Lewis telethons that you recorded on a broken VCR while high on acid, then you're going to make some brisk sales. Consider relaxing your no shirt, no service policy if you have one. As we observed before, this cluster likes to keep it casual and loose. This cluster doesn't browse, so this is the one group where it is acceptable for a sales associate to sit at their ZineFest table, sullenly and silently Instagramming or sketching on their iPad, answering all questions only with a mm-hmm. And lastly, keep it real with trades or cash only. Iconoclastic Lifestyles doesn't have a credit card and doesn't know what a Venmo is. All right, so with that, I'm going to stop my screen sharing and I'm going to open it up for questions.
There was a question in the chat from Wayne Link, so I'm just going to turn it over to Wayne and let him ask the question.
Great.
Sure, Heather, thanks, great presentation. Question about the different segmentations. Do you happen to have the engagement and conversion rates for each of those segments?
Yes, I do. So don't quote me on this, but off the top of my head, with the comfortable complacents, we're really only seeing 0.6 for conversion and engagement. So essentially 99% of this cluster doesn't engage or convert. As you move further along, with the all curious, you do see a conversion rate of about maybe 1.5, and you do see an engagement rate somewhere in the neighborhood of 3%. With Bohemian Ways, you see a engagement rate increase significantly, kind of getting a little bit closer to a conversion rate of about closer to 3, and then engagement rate about 5.7. And what's really astonishing is with the iconoclastic lifestyles cluster, you see a conversion rate of 16.7, which is really significant, which is again why that cluster is defined as your confirmed core consumer.
Interesting. Do we know anything about where these core people live?
Well, as I said, there are some limitations to this sample. So we know that we've observed the behavior in a particular neighborhood in Denver, but as of yet, there's really no way to reliably gauge where the consumer lives, the urbanacity of the consumer, whether or not they are a local or a tourist. Certainly further research is pending and necessary in order to be able to take these insights national.
One other question, sorry to monopolize the questions here, but you mentioned that the traffic was heavily skewed people going north. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, it was an interesting finding.
I was curious, was engagement or conversion different among people going north versus other directions?
It was, in fact. So consumers who were traveling north were more likely to both engage and convert. And so there are some theories to this. Given the neighborhood of the study area, the more kind of commercial district lies to the north of the Lille. And so it's theorized that consumers who are maybe heading towards commerce or heading towards a restaurant or a bar were perhaps more primed to engage or to convert, whereas consumers who were heading south were heading to a more residential part of the neighborhood. And in that instance, we're maybe just heading home. But again, it's really difficult to say because, as I mentioned to your earlier question, there's no way for us to know if any of the traffic observed in the sample is local, if they in fact even live in the neighborhood. So it's really just a theory at this point.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we're just open to general questions. If no one has a question, I might chime in with a couple points of clarification, but prefer to leave it open to anyone else on the call.
Yeah, no, I think I've got a few questions here. So as far as the Bohemian Ways, and it seems as though converting them may be easier, as you stated before, but I'd like you to maybe address more towards garnering the comfortable complacents into our market and how we would engage them, and draw them in with, again, you said safer titles might be able to draw them into us a little better, but how do we get them into the meat of our our art, our work?
Yeah.
And get those things in their hands, really.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can understand the desire to, in order to be able to win over this segment. I will say, part of that allure is the fact that, if you do it, it's such a massive, segment of our population. So the opportunity for revenue is certainly huge. However, one should be prepared if you're going to try to engage this cluster that it's going to be extremely expensive to be able to do so. But some ways in which you can reduce your risk of this investment is to, again, look at those in the cluster who have familial romantic or social ties with people who are part of these other clusters. So that comfortable complacent would have maybe never taken a look at a zine or gone to a zine fest on their own. But if they were dragged against their will, you know, you have a chance there to where you can engage them, because you have to think about it from their perspective. They're probably really, really bored and are looking for something else to do besides check Instagram again. Another thing to consider too is that, you know, a lot of this social conformity index system is based off of this idea that consumers move through different clusters throughout their life cycle. And it's something that we observed is that different clusters tend to have a higher concentration of consumers in different age groups. And so it's theorized that, you know, there's this kind of a funnel where someone can start up in that all curious cluster, move into Bohemian Ways, ultimately moving down to iconoclastic lifestyles, but you're going to have a lot of spillover at all of those different stages. So you may have a consumer who in their younger years was all curious, but as they aged became comfortable complacent, and that potentially might be an opportunity. So perhaps titles that can appeal to things that were cool to them when they were younger is a way to maybe reel them back in. So I would consider that.
Right. So nostalgia being important to a lot of people, and I mean, I can see that wavering, you know, throughout one's lifestyle, throughout one's life cycle, as you stated.
Yeah.
Speaking to that, how would we keep that moving? How does that motion like stay in effect? Obviously, the comfortable complacents are a wide, as you said, the largest part of like society in general and at large, and the largest range of age groups. Do you think something along the lines of like outside of a zine fest, like a sandwich boards or anything to kind of reach out to these, you know, wavering complacents? I don't know. You know,
Yeah.
something to distract them outside of their phones and their family members.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting. So this cluster, you know, out of all the other clusters, so we noted this in the description, they live busy, active lifestyles. They're very interested in fitness, walking, jogging. They really enjoy those little electric scooters, and you know, they tend to socialize a lot with their friends, go to brunch, go shopping. They're frequently observed carrying shopping bags and or takeout bags. So you know, one thing you can consider are partnerships with local businesses that comfortable complacents patronize. So perhaps there is a partnership that you can offer with a brunch spot that they enjoy, where, you know, if they purchase one of your zines, they can get 20% off of their bottomless mimosas. Or a partnership with perhaps a local running store where, again, they purchase a zine that has to do with one of their hobbies, such as fitness, and it gives them some sort of discount on a product they like. Because what's interesting about this cluster is we know that they like to buy shit, but we just need to figure out how to get them to buy zines.
Right. Now, so the little is stationary, correct? Maybe if perhaps if it was mobilized, we'd follow them whilst they're on their way to brunch or in these performing these activities. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, but another important thing to consider though is you know, if you invest your time in positioning the LIL in an area where you have a high concentration of comfortable complacents, you're missing out on an opportunity to engage those clusters that you know you're going to have a higher likelihood of engaging. And so it's a tactic that I would undertake with a lot of caution. And I wouldn't do it on those really kind of important day parts and days of the week that we know are really important to some of these other clusters. So for example, we know Bohemian Ways likes to convert on a weekday. So I wouldn't move my LIL on a day or time that I know is important for these other clusters, because you may be losing those sales. So if you want to employ this strategy, you may need to scale up, have multiple sales associates, have multiple point of purchase displays. So you're not making it difficult for your core consumers to engage and convert.
Yeah, yeah, I was actually going to ask a question about some of these clusters needing the repetitiveness of the of in these cycles to cite perhaps would amplify those cycles, you know, because of their usual consumer systems working off of repetitive POP, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think, it's interesting, again, with the Bohemian Ways and their preference for converting on a weekday. My sense is that it has to do with browsing on the weekend. We know most engagement, we know most browsing happens then. So I think, you raise a really great point of, you can't always close a sale during that one interaction, and that you do need to be more present in a consumer's life, essentially, in order to get them to convert.
Heather, this is Wayne. I have another question. I really think your co-merchandising idea is really terrific. I really like that idea. I know you don't have any data on this, but any speculation as to what other categories would work best to co-merchandise this with?
Certainly. Yeah. So I would say that, any opportunity to co-merchandise with a local record store would be a win, especially for any zinesters that are making zines about how punk rock saved their life or any other kind of obscure musical scene. Gosh, let's see. I think what's really kind of charming, though, about zines is that they tend to embrace the unconventional and I think kind of unaddressed in most commercial sectors of our society. So, it's difficult to tie the co-merchandising to the zine subject matter. What I would do is think about what are some other purchase behaviors for that cluster and go there. And I think that's a limitation of this system, is that, given the way that we collected and analyze this data, we don't really have a lot of information on other consumer behaviors. And so, if we get that and can add that to this system, then I think we'll have some more potent ideas for co-merchandising.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, can I tag on a question to that? So, I think most often when people who make zines seek to distribute them, their logical place to go is to other bookstores. So now that I'm hearing your kind of insights and thoughts regarding co-merchandising, I suspect that might not be the best place to distribute zines because there's like so much competition or noise in the same kind of sector. So I don't know if you could speak to that at all.
Sorry, so trying to understand the question. So what specific opportunities there are to co-merchandise with bookstores?
No, is it a bad strategy to try to distribute through bookstores when there's really just a lot of competition for published material versus, say, putting them in a record store where people are going to collect kind of like or going to purchase collectible analog media? If you
Yeah. Yeah, so I would say probably not. A zine is a really distinct product from most books that you would find at any kind of conventional bookstore. So the nature of the fact that they're a zine is a key differentiator. So this issue of thinking that if you're in this bookstore with a lot of books, that there would be too much competition it's like apples to oranges. So I wouldn't really let that dissuade any kind of zinester. However, I would encourage them to negotiate with that bookstore owner on merchandising. So that's something that we know is important no matter what it is that you're selling. You want generally your merchandise to be accessible to the consumer, something they don't have to ask somebody for help to reach, something that they can touch on their own. You want it to be at eye level. You want it to be well lit. You want it to ideally be in a place of the store where if it's a lower priced item, which most zines are, that consumer is more primed to make that impulse purchase. So if you can have your zines merchandised at eye level, well lit, and accessible to the consumer, perhaps near point of sale, that's an opportunity, certainly, for you to increase your sales. With this consumer waiting in line to purchase their more conventional literature, and they see this thing for $5 and they just throw it in their basket. So that certainly is an opportunity. I would say that broadly speaking, any opportunity for a zine stir to increase their sales channels is going to be an opportunity to increase their sales. The caveat there is you don't want to choose one over the other. So you wouldn't want to exclusively sell your zines at a bookstore and decide not to sell them online as a result. But when you diversify those sales channels, that's where you're going to really start seeing an increase in your revenue.
Are there any more questions? And if not, maybe a couple points of clarification.
Yeah, perhaps one more thing. I think, I guess in speaking to maybe drawing more people, towards the, sorry, was the 8 and 9, my notes are mixed up here. Moving out of Bohemian Ways into like someone that is going to be purchasing zines. I recall you said that, the comfortable complacents do like to buy shit, and pulling from that and, partnering with other types of businesses outside of record stores and bookstores. Do you think that the brunch crowd, maybe someone, I think that may be a market where a lot of these demographics kind of blend, and this generally being something that takes place on the weekends, maybe you can get more people to lean towards Bohemian Ways, return during the week, placing a little somewhere in that, in that area, or again, just stepping outside of the record store and the bookstore.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's perfectly consistent with the advice of the more you're able to diversify your sales channels and scale up in a way that's sustainable for your business, you will likely increase your sales. Another thing we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about is that, there certainly is an opportunity to produce zines that appeal to the values and things that comfortable complacents care about. So one thing that's kind of been the underpinning of all of this that maybe we need to be a little bit more blunt about is that zine content is not typically something that comfortable complacents are interested in. However, if one were producing zines about golden retrievers or how fun it is to go to brunch, then perhaps a zine about brunch would be a hit among comfortable complacents. The issue is that there are a lot of zine publishers who are not really interested in catering to this group. So it certainly is an opportunity for one who's willing to go there.
Thank you.
Any last question? Heather, I do have just a lighthearted point of clarification. I noticed in your bio you said you had 30 years of experience, and you don't really seem much older than that. So can you clarify?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I actually produced my first zine at the age of 6. It was a title called Megan Had a Carrot Nose. And that's where I really I got hooked on this exciting sector. And additionally, I was raised in a family that was very well versed and skilled in market research. So I was exposed to those concepts as well as a young age. And I think that's what really, where my unrelenting passion for using data and insights to increase sales in this sector comes from.
Excellent, thank you. And unless anyone has any other questions, I would like to thank you all for, oh yeah, go ahead, Eric.
I don't know if it's really a question, but I don't know, man. I kind of feel a certain way about the longboard guys. I don't know any personally, but,
I mean,
maybe they just come back later. Maybe
It was an interesting finding, that's for certain.
yeah.
They're so silly.
aren't they though?
Well, I just want to thank you all so much for taking the time to invest in yourself and invest in your business. And I hope these insights were helpful for you. And you, of course, can reach me at any time at the Institute of Sociometry. And I look forward to hearing about your success.